Associative learning is the linking of two events or stimuli. So for example, if you have a dog, when you pick up the dog's leash and the dog sees the leash, the dog runs for the door to go for a walk. So the dog sees the leash and it knows that it goes outside. It's associatively linked these two pieces of information. So conditioning is the process by which we develop these associations between pieces of information, connecting environmental stimuli to behaviors. In this video, we will discuss classical conditioning, which is one type of associative learning. With classical conditioning, we start with a stimulus that elicits a response. Then we take a neutral stimulus and associate that stimulus to the same response. So we form this association here. So then the neutral stimulus elicits the response after conditioning. This is the result of conditioning. And the stimulus here is no longer considered neutral. So let's go over an example, that of Pavlov's dogs. Ivan Pavlov looked at the salivary response of dogs to different types of food. This is a reflex, a non-voluntary response. So he hooked his dogs up to these saliva collection chambers, looked at how much saliva they produced when given different stimuli. This was in the early days of psychology, back in the late 1800s, and he made some observations. He saw salivation with food, and that made sense. This was the reflex that he was studying. So then he saw something that annoyed him because it made his research difficult. He saw the dogs salivating before the food was even presented, and this led to many questions. It seemed like the dog had associated other cues, like the sight of the lab technician, for example, with the presentation of food. This led Pavlov to study this process intensely. Salivating at the sight of a lab technician was not a reflex, so how was this learned by experience? So let's talk through what's going on here in this classical conditioning framework. We start before conditioning happens, and we have the unconditioned response, and we abbreviate this as UR. And in this case, the unconditioned response is the production of saliva. It's an automatic behavior, it's not learned, and it results from the presentation of an unconditioned stimulus, in this case, the presence of food. So we have food as our US, our unconditioned stimulus, and this produces the unconditioned response, or the production of saliva. And this is what's going on before learning, before our conditioning process. Then we have the process of conditioning, where we take a neutral stimulus and pair it with our US. In the early observations, the neutral stimulus might have been the lab technician, or the sight of the bowl, or being hooked up to the salivary measurement device. So in experiments exploring conditioning, Pavlov needed to more carefully control the stimulus. He often used clicks or bells. We'll use a bell in our case, and this is our neutral stimulus.
So during conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus are presented together, and then the unconditioned response occurs in response to the US. Learning occurs when the neutral stimulus becomes associated with the unconditioned stimulus. Once this association has been learned, we can remove the unconditioned stimulus, and we'll see salivation in response to the neutral stimulus.
Now that the conditioning has successfully led to this new association, this is no longer a neutral stimulus, and we say the bell is the conditioned stimulus, and this produces the conditioned response, in this case, the production of saliva. So in this case, the UR, the unconditioned response, and the CR, the conditioned response, are the same, but this is not always the case. The CR is usually weaker than the UR, so we see some differences between the two. So with classical conditioning, the result is that the CS now produces the CR. And we don't need the unconditioned stimulus anymore to elicit this response. So here we are after learning, after conditioning. I want you to try to think of some examples from your life of classical conditioning. Remember, the UR should be an involuntary response, like an emotional response, a reflex, or a physiological change, and not a voluntary behavior. One key aspect of classical conditioning to keep in mind is that the stimulus occurs before the response.
We learn to associate stimuli and consequently to anticipate events.
So let's dig into the process of classical conditioning a little bit. Here I'm going to draw out what that process looks like. So on the y-axis I'm putting the response, the conditioned response, so the magnitude of the response in some arbitrary units. And on the x-axis I'm showing the number of trials or repetitions that we have in our training process. So during this phase, we're presenting the unconditioned stimulus along with the conditioned stimulus, okay? And we see that the CR increases with repeat exposures, with repeat trials. The CR is what we would get if we just showed the CS. It's basically like if we tested the CS alone after the trial indicated, this is what our CR would be.
So we see this association between the unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus increase during this initial phase.
Then if we remove the US, if we remove the unconditioned stimulus and we have the conditioned stimulus only, then we see the CR is going to slowly diminish over trials.
So we learn an association between the US and the neutral stimulus in this orange region, and we call this the acquisition phase. We are acquiring the association. And so when we remove the US in this green region, the association between the US and the CS weakens over repeated trials. We call this the extinction phase because that association is extinguishing.
But if we take a break and come back later and then present the CS alone, we see something interesting happen. So here we're presenting just the conditioned stimulus, so we have no unconditioned stimulus. So for our example, we would be just presenting the bell. We see a stronger CR than we did at the end of the last testing session. This is called spontaneous recovery, which happens after a break. Now if we keep presenting the CS, the CR will continue to get weaker, as you see here by trial 5. We can see spontaneous recovery again after another break, but again, the CR gets weaker as we repeat exposures when we present just the CS.
We would have to add back the unconditioned stimulus, the site of the food, to reform that association between the US and the CS, which was the bell, that we saw in the acquisition phase.
Not all stimuli are precisely identical. For example, when we're talking about a conditioned stimulus as a beep, we might see variability in the frequency of the sound, the duration, the volume, or the background noise that's present. These things can all vary. So generally, there is some flexibility in the stimulus that will elicit a particular response. This is called generalization. For example, if you involuntarily get excited when you see chocolate cake, that associative learning might lead to a similar response of excitement to a different type of cake, or maybe even to a pie. On the other side, we can see different responses to similar stimuli, and this is a process called discrimination. For example, when eating a mushroom out in the forest, there might be 2 mushrooms that look similar, but one is edible and one is poisonous. It's important, even though they look similar, that we learn to discriminate between these 2 stimuli. So that wraps up classical conditioning, which is the process by which we learn to associate stimuli with anticipated events. These are generally unconscious responses, and we have the stimulus occurring before the response. We'll go over more examples of these concepts in class, and we'll practice identifying the different types of stimuli and responses in classical conditioning scenarios.